Hello and welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, Anna Isabel. And my guest today is Graham Phillips. Hello, Graham.
Hello. Thank you
Well,
very much for having me on the show. Wonderful.
you're very welcome. I was very intrigued by your book. It's called The Mystery of Doggerland, Atlantis in the North Sea. So here it is. And obviously, the question that has to be asked first is, what is Doggerland?
Okay, Doggerland is an area of dry land that once connected Great Britain to the continent, to Norway, France, Holland, places like that. And this was there because when the sea levels were lower during the last ice age, because so much of the water was tied up in ice, there was this land area that was there for thousands of years. People lived on it, people crossed it from mainland continent to Britain. That's how people first inhabited Britain. And then after the ice age finished about 12,000 years ago, the sea levels rose and it was flooded. But one part remained, an island about the size of modern day Wales, or should we say for Americans about the size of Rhode Island, something like that. And it was off the east coast of Scotland, northeast coast of Scotland, and it was there until about 5000 BC, before it finally sank. And it was never thought to be particularly inhabited. It might have been inhabited sometimes by fishing people and so forth. But the recent archaeological research has suggested not only was it inhabited, it had an advanced civilization, comparatively, that is, and the people that came from there when that eventually sank were those who built Stonehenge.
Now, see, that's what made me really curious. But there is a large gap of time, is there not, if I remember correctly from reading, between the building of Stonehenge and Doggerland as it would have been?
Yes, absolutely. Doggerland finally sank around 5000 BC. Now, Stonehenge doesn't get built for about another 1,500 years. Now, what's happening in the meantime? Well, it used to be thought that the megalithic civilization, which is what the people that built Stonehenge are known as, began around south of England, it's around Stonehenge, and progressively moved north. Now, throughout Britain and Ireland, there are thousands of stone circles that still survive. Stonehenge is just the most famous. It's far from the biggest. It's about 100 feet in diameter. 20 miles to north of Stonehenge, there's a massive stone circle called Avebury, which is 1,000 feet in diameter. It's got stones up to 40 tons, massive by Stonehenge standards. But Stonehenge is the only one to have those lintel stones around the top to form like the arches. But there were many stone circles throughout the British Isles. Recent archaeological research since the invention of modern dating techniques has shown that the oldest stone circles are those at the very north of Scotland, particularly on the Orkney Isles, just off the north of Scotland, about 10 miles north of the very far tip of Scotland. And it was there that the first stone circle started to be built. And it gradually moved south. And that's why Stonehenge doesn't get built for another 1,000 years or so. In fact, the very earliest bit of Stonehenge didn't look like what we know today. And that was built about 3000 BC. So around so you got 2,000-year gap. But in that time, suddenly these stone circle builders appeared on the Orkney Isles. They were building stone circles, massive ones. The third biggest stone circle in the British Isles is on the Orkney Isles. That dates from much earlier. And in fact, it dates to about well over 3,500 BC. But you've still got this great big long gap. So what happened? Well, now there has been underwater archaeology off the Orkney Isles and about a mile or so off the shore, and also further out than that, they found underwater stone circles that could only have been built before the land submerged over 4,000 years ago. So you finally got the thing all coming together.
So, for viewers, let's do a time comparison then between the age of Doggerland and say the Egyptian pyramids.
Doggerland 5000 BC sinks. For a period after that, you've got it existing on land around there that was still above sea level, which sank by 4000 BC. 3000 BC, the first stone circles in the south of England are being built, like the ones I mentioned, such as the early Stone Henge and Avebury. 2500 BC is when Stonehenge, as we know it today, came into existence. That's the same time as the Great Pyramids. This is 1,000 years before the first civilization in Central America, and about 1,000 years before there was a civilization worth talking about in China. The first big civilizations emerged about 3000 BC, some in what is now Iraq, others in what is now Pakistan. So you're talking about way before that, but you are talking about well after Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which is a freak outlier. That's about 10,000 BC, way before anything else. This is the next oldest thing, but it's still 10,000 years later. Some people are suggesting that the people who lived on Doggerland may originally have come from Göbekli Tepe, where they did build stone circles, although completely different sort.
I did wonder about that. I was good. That was my next question. Is the between Göbekli Tepe and Doggerland. So okay, so just coming back to focus on the British Isles and the stone circles, given that there is such a long continuity from Doggerland leading up to Stonehenge, the time when that's built, do we know whether the stone circles that were built were consistently built in the same way, or were there changes that show that there's a culture that's developing and evolving, or was it really just everything being passed down the line in a very stable way? What do we know?
The second thing you just said, what happens is this stone circle that's been found under the water off the coast of the Orkneys, 4000 BC. I mean, that's years ago. That's 6,000 years ago. That consists of a stone circle around about 700 feet in diameter. It's huge. And we're not talking starting little and building out. It's huge. It had stones, about 50 stones up to 15 feet high, weighing up to 20 tons. It also was surrounded by a ditch and embankment about 30 feet high and 30 feet deep, which would have been about over half a mile in circumference. You're talking about huge, and that's just part of what's known as a megalithic complex. There was also a nearby artificial hill that may originally have been 100 feet high or more. And in addition to that, there was avenues of stones and other monuments, and that is known as a megalithic complex. On the Orkney Islands itself, you've got another megalithic complex called the Stone complex. You've got the Ring of Brodgar, this third biggest stone circle in the country, exactly like this thing under the water. It's almost identical, except the one on the land's more complete and better preserved. Nearby, there's a smaller stone circle called an outlier stone circle called the Stones of Stone. A avenue of stones went between them, and there's a nearby artificial hillock, typical megalithic complex of monuments in one area. So you've got the same happening 4000 BC under the water, same thing exactly around about just over 3000 BC, 3000 to 3500 BC on land. You've then got right the way down. So let's just jump forward a bit to Avebury, that very big circle that I was talking about just north of Stonehenge. That's pretty much identical to what's on the Orkney Isles, except it's bigger, and other ones like that. I mean, Avebury is a megalithic complex. It has a big stone circle, which I said before is about 1,000 feet diameter stone circle. It's got avenues of stones leading away from it. It's got a ditch and embankment around it. And it's got a huge artificial hillock over 300 feet tall that's still that high, even after erosion, that's been excavated, and they found no signs of burials or chambers within it. So it's just an artificial hill. That's called Silbury Hill. All that is part of the Avebury megalithic complex, except although apart from the fact it's bigger, it's identical to these earlier ones that were on the Orkneys and now under the water. And that doesn't date until about 2500 BC. So you've got 2.5, is that 2.5? 1.5, 2,500, 3,000. That's 1,500 years without things changing much. Stone Henge is an advancement, but that seems to be like a one-off. But generally speaking, until the end of the megalithic age, which probably finished around about 1000 BC, when the Celts began to turn up from mainland Europe, and the Bronze Age and the Iron Age was well underway, they didn't basically, if anything, it went backwards a bit from there. So what you're talking about is a megalithic. I mean, to get the skills to build those kind of things, although they might seem primitive by our standards, when you've got nothing other than Stone Age implements to do it with, you know, you haven't got tractors and bulldozers and cranes. Took a lot of, they would have taken a lot of trial and error. That trial and error didn't take place anywhere in Britain. This culture emerged fully developed on the Orkney Isles, or just off them now under the water. So it must have developed somewhere else. And there's nowhere in Scandinavia or mainland Europe or anywhere that has these same kind of megalithic complexes of the same type. So it must have developed on Doggerland. So Doggerland has to be more advanced than anywhere else in Britain or most of Europe before it sank.
So what do we know about the people who lived there? Do we have any sense of trade, of art? What do we know?
Well, all we know now is that a tiny bit of Doggerland that still survives above the sea. And that is a tiny island called Fair Isle, which is about 50 miles north of the Orkneys. Now, for those of you who live in Britain, you may hear sometimes of shipping forecasts, and they talk about weather in different parts of the country. Fair Isle is the name of the sea area north of the Orkney Islands and south of the Shetlands. And this island, small, tiny island, Fair Isle, was once a sort of high land at the very north of Doggerland. And it still survives. And it's only since they found, no one really thought to look there for anything. I mean, you know, looked around, but no one thought to dig or do geological surveys or you know, geophysics or anything there to see if there was any evidence of occupation. Nobody thought that anybody would have lived there until they found this underwater circle. And that was only found in 2011. And it wasn't excavated, it wasn't, the divers didn't go there and find out exactly what was going on for some years after that. And then it was held up again through financial problems. So it's only very recently in the last few years that there's been enough evidence that there was a civilization on Doggerland for anyone to think of going and doing any archaeological work on Fair Isle. What's been found out from there is fascinating. There are I say advanced, there are sophisticated villages where they're built from stonework in such a way that you wouldn't really find again anywhere in the world until the first civilization at Sumer in what's now Iraq and ancient Egypt. You've got, I mean, it wasn't quite as advanced as that, but it was more advanced than anything else. And they built these brick walls under the ground with tunnels connecting between the various different dwellings to protect them from the weather. This very sophisticated setup, and it had a plumbing system. Okay, it didn't have pipes, but it had a kind of drainage system, plumbing and sewage system. Basically, these people were really clean. And next to it, they were found a couple of buildings that they couldn't quite explain at first, or the remains of them, because there was all this burnt charcoal there, until they realized they were saunas. They had saunas, and the saunas weren't supposed to have been invented until they were invented in Finland, you know, 1,500 years later. You've also got the fact that in order to try and keep back the sea, it seems, for all they knew, the last people who dwelt there, they retreated to this mountain or whatever this was, the high land at the north of Doggerland. As the seas encroached, they were trying to keep them back. They were able somehow to what they call vitrify the walls. They had walls, they built them from stone, and then somehow heated them, somehow by putting fires over it or whatever, until the rocks melted and fused together. Now, the later Iron Age people of Scotland and elsewhere in Europe were able to do this, but they were able to create temperatures hot enough to smelt iron. That was a much later culture. We're talking about 500 BC as opposed to 5000 BC. How they did that, nobody knows. And what I find really remarkable is they found pottery there that, when analyzed, was found to contain herbs and plant extracts, and which could only have been used for medicinal purposes, rather than, you wouldn't eat them for pleasure. They weren't hallucinogenic. They didn't have any value except for medicinally, like analgesics. The fact that some there, the first analgesics known in the world, the earliest, that weren't reproduced again until Victorian period. And I mean, I could go on, but these people were pretty advanced.
That's quite exceptional. So I'm now thinking about them coming onto what we now think of as Britain. So coming out of the islands and coming into what we see as mainland Britain, or maybe even Ireland also. And I'm thinking about the Celts coming in and how that might have changed them, or whether they changed the Celts. What's the feeling on this?
Well, the Celts, like most civilizations in Britain, all civilizations in Britain before the Romans, had no form of writing. They obviously didn't consider it worthwhile. What the Celts did, they were here until the Romans arrived. Well, they were still here afterwards, but the Romans conquered them. What the Celts did to record what was going on in tribally and other things they needed to record was they trained a group of people with amazing memory techniques, and they used forms of hypnosis. Now, we know this because Julius Caesar and others write about them. They use forms of hypnosis to remember vast amounts of information. And Caesar talks about this in his book, The Gallic Wars. And what happened is that these people, because they were the libraries, the living libraries of Celtic civilization, became really important. They also became the priesthood, and they're the people that the Romans referred to as the Druids. Now, the Druids were known, most people know them as the Celtic priesthood, and they go around doing mystical stuff, but it was their ability to have amazing memories and perform feats of hypnosis that made them really, really important. Now, according to Celtic mythology, remember they had no form of writing before the Romans turned up. The Celts arrived, first wave arrived about 1000 BC, and they were Bronze Age Celts. And then you've got a later group about 700 BC, which are the Iron Age Celts. They're the Celts we all know and love. They're the ones we get, that's what Boudica and people like that. They're those people. And they, in their mythology that was recorded by the Romans, also in Irish mythology, which was written down by the early Christian church, the priests that were trying to convert them, from these various sources, we learn that the Druids, according to their own and the Celtic belief, were already here, already practicing these remarkable things. Medicine as well. They had great knowledge of herbal medicines, and they were able to build much better than the Celts. They were already here. They were the priesthood of the people who already existed in Britain before the Celts arrived. So it seems that perhaps the Druids are or at least were, the last remnants of the megalithic culture, or if you like, going all the way back, the people of Doggerland.
That's exactly what I was wondering, was how they interacted, and whether perhaps, and I guess whether perhaps the Druids were linked with the earlier people. And the reason I asked is because we seem to have this association between the Druids and Stone Henge and other stone circles. So it made me wonder whether they were the original people here. So, and you've answered that question. So thank you for that. Um, well, this is I'm just there's so many thoughts going on in my mind, and I really like the fact that the Romans were writing about this. So so I imagine there's something in the ancient Greek um, writings as well.
Yeah, the ancient Greek writings, what's fascinating about them is that they tell us less, that the Romans tell us far more about what the Celts did day to day. The Greeks are more interested in their mythology, what they believed. And early Greek visitors to Britain say that the people here, the Celts, had legends and mythology that there once existed a an island somewhere off the coast of Britain. They're not told where, they're not told it's north, south, east, or west originally, but there was this island off the coast of Britain that was said to have had a civilization. And they actually record one particular writer, I think his name's Pomponius Mela, so he's kind of half Greek, half Roman, said that he describes a stone circle. He calls it he refers to it as a temple of the sun. But his description is clearly a stone circle. And he says that the people of Britain believe that the people who built these originally came from this island that sank beneath the waves when the gods became angry. So it's almost as if within the folklore, I mean, obviously, if the Druids came from there and they could have these amazing memory techniques and they were the libraries of the civilization, the stories would have been handed down. So, what seems to be being shown by archaeology today was already recorded by the classical writers, having talked to the people of Britain centuries ago. So that is, and also if you look into the mythology of the Celts, particularly that recorded by monks when they were Christianizing Ireland in the 5th century, they're basically recording some of this stuff and saying it's all fanciful, superstition. But they say that this island was called Thule, or some people pronounce it Thule, but it's not pronounced that. And the word Thule has become associated with all sorts of islands all over the world. But Thule was supposed to be an island that lay off the north of Scotland. And when Julius Caesar arrived and tried to conquer Britain, he failed and went back home again. And it wasn't conquered for another 100 years. But when he first came here in 55 BC, he heard tales of Thule being this amazing island. Presumably people there thought it still existed and still had this amazing civilization. And he actually sent a kind of envoy or a bunch of people to sail around Britain. I don't know if you call it an envoy or a voyage or an expedition or something. And they went up to the north of Scotland. They saw, the weather got bad. They had to come back. They saw what probably was the Orkney Isles and said they had caught they managed to see Thule in the distance but couldn't get there. So this shows that the story of where these people came from was never forgotten.
So I guess the question that springs to mind is this why the Romans were interested in something so far north?
Yes, originally the Romans, I mean, basically Romans conquered what's now England and Wales, and then went on to move north from Scotland. In fact, they started to try and conquer Scotland even before they'd gone into properly conquered Wales. And they tried to get to the north of Scotland, but it was so difficult fighting in mountainous terrain with hostile tribes all around you that they had to pull back and eventually built Hadrian's Wall in the north of England. So the reason they wanted to go there is always been something of a mystery. What did they expect to find up there? It could be that they were hoping if they could get close enough to where this island was, they would find a civilization at the north of Scotland that was more advanced, that they had stuff. I mean, the Romans were only interested in acquiring stuff, wealth, knowledge, whatever it was, minerals. And it was sort of, in a sense, their attempt to conquer Scotland was like a failed version of the conquistadors' attempt to conquer Central America. There it succeeded. Why were the conquistadors interested in Central America? Because of gold. Well, the various myths and legends that the Romans learned, what was supposed to be north of Scotland, was a very rich and prosperous place. You don't get rich and prosperous without gold. So I think this is the sort of thing they were looking for. At least you don't get rich and prosperous apart from gold from the Roman perspective, or silver, or something worth having.
It seems to me that in the last few years, as I've become more attuned to this type of research, that it's very possible that the history that we've been taught is somewhat lacking, and that we need to be paying more attention to the legends that have been dismissed as myth. What do you feel?
Well, you've got two types of people who tell us about the past, reveal the past. Historians who consult written manuscripts, and archaeologists who dig up the ground and find things. They're both great and excellent at what they do. But if you don't find something immediately in the ground, and besides anything else, if you're not digging in the right place, and I mean, Göbekli Tepe was there, for centuries, millions, well, not millions, thousands and thousands of years before anybody sort of rediscovered it. And it was only rediscovered by accident anyway. And then you go on the other side, you've got the historians who know all about ancient manuscripts, or even more modern manuscripts, but manuscripts that tell us about the past, and they all know what they're doing. But unless there's something being recorded, or we know where those records are, and unless we actually know where to dig and we know what we're looking for, there's a massive area in the middle which is completely unknown. And that's where mythology comes in. I mean, I'll give you one example of something that whereby a myth really revealed that there was something there. On Bodmin Moor in Cornwall in southwest England, there is a mound called Willington Barrow, and it's a burial mound that dates back to around 3000 BC. I mean, we're talking old here. There'd always been a legend there, and it was recorded in folklore going back hundreds of years, that if people got lost on the moors, they would see a druid, a ghostly druid, would appear from nowhere and offer them a drink from a golden cup. Now, that had been a myth for years. It was only relatively recently that archaeologists dug this tomb up, which was what this mound was, and inside found the remains of probably an ancient priest buried with a golden cup, and it dated from about 5,000 years ago. So this must be a memory, unless there was really a ghostly druid there. It's a memory that has been passed down firstly by word of mouth, and then in the form of myths and legends. And I can quote, I can tell you dozens and dozens of similar examples throughout Britain alone like that.
Well, I like that. I like that very much. Perhaps a ghost, perhaps not. So I guess the question that many people might ask is, so what? So civilization might be older than what we expected. I'll let you have a go at answering that. So what? Why is this important?
The so what is basically in how they ended up dying and what happened to them. Because I know global warming is a very contentious issue. And the thing about my book, Doggerland, I wrote a feature about it for Graham Hancock's website. He asked me to put something up there, and people could comment on it. And so many people were saying, how dare he's talking about global warming? That's a conspiracy. It doesn't exist. The fact is that the Earth did warm after the Ice Age, or we'd still be in it. And when the Earth warmed, when the seas rose, things happened. It wasn't just that people got flooded. Archaeologists now, by excavating around the Orkney Isles and these undersea excavations, and also on Fair Isle, have shown that there was tidal waves, that there was even disease when the ice melted. And how did disease come about? Well, microbes of which we have no resistance are trapped in the ice melts, the tundra melts, the pathogens are released, people get sick, and there's massive plagues. Now, these are the sort of things that did happen before. Half the fauna of the Northern Hemisphere disappeared. The big things like mammoths and mastodons and smilodons and all these things, everyone thought, oh, well, humans hunted them to extinction. There is no evidence of that anymore. It was basically caused by the sudden climate change. Now, if you believe in climate change, then it's a warning from the past. So in this particular case, there's a very good reason to study what happened at that time.
Actually, thinking about that has made me think about the universal nature of the flood stories. So clearly we do live on a planet that, irrespective of what we're doing, has its own sweet pace at which different things happen. And so because we are in this universe, so whatever the reasons might be, things do change on this planet, and sometimes the changes are quite catastrophic and happen over time. And we can see that flood stories exist pretty much universally all over the world.
And they all relate to places that basically ended up sinking or being tidal waved at the end of the last ice age. I mean, flood stories are written down, say, around 3000 BC in Samaria and in northern India and places in China and places like this. These flood stories, and they refer to sinking of towns in certain areas. When you look at those areas, you find out that the underwater archaeology that's been done has shown that these were early, fairly sophisticated settlements that were established after the Ice Age, close to the shores, which sank at that time. And it must have been remembered until finally written down. So, yes, you're right.
I guess the last question, which I guess I've been saving for last, is this Atlantis then? Is Doggerland Atlantis?
No, I never. The publishers liked this. I said the title was originally going to be. I'm blaming the publishers for this. The title was originally going to be. Somebody had said, "Well, it's like Atlantis, isn't it?" I said, "The Atlantis of the North Sea" was the original thing. In other words, it's an Atlantis legend of the North Sea. If you like, something like Lemuria is the Atlantis of the Indian Ocean. Mu is the Atlantis of the Pacific Ocean. I was saying the Atlantis of the North Sea. But somehow, and I don't know at what point, it changed to Atlantis in the North Sea, as if people were saying there was Atlantis. But I do talk about Atlantis in the book, and I've written a whole chapter in there somewhere about how it might be, the historical Atlantis might be at near the Straits of Gibraltar, just out into the Atlantic of the north of Africa, and an island that sunk there at the end of the last ice age.
Fantastic. Now you have several intriguing books, and Atlantis and the 10 Plagues of Egypt, I could see one title here, Chalice of Magdalene. So I think that for those, I suppose, of a romantic disposition who love history and ancient history, I think they have quite a lot to discover through your books. But the book that we have been discussing today is called The Mystery of Doggerland, and here it is. So I'll be putting a link to this in the description box. And if people want to learn more about your work, Graham, where do they go?
My website is grahamphillips.net. So just imagine me with a net over my head, then you won't forget and think it's .com, grahamphillips.net. There are links there on the first page to everything, my Facebook, my YouTube channel, and whatever else. And also all the books are on the first page. You just click on one, you get all the information about them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for watching. Next time, we're going to be looking at Hermeticism.